Hi, it's Trevor with ReadyLIFT, and I'm here today to talk to you about the 2019 GM 1500. Whether you're installing our kits at home or you're in a shop, we have a variety of leveling or SST kits, and we just want to go over some of the tips and tricks that we've found that work well with the new body style. Much of what we're talking about today is illustrated in our instructions, and if you go onto our website, we will always have the updated version, the most current version. So feel free to go on to ReadyLIFT.com and look up your kit, and it'll have all the information you need on there. A lot of what we're going over today will kind of go over GM's new boot design on their CVs. We've noticed that they're a little bit more delicate than previous years. They've made a more rugged boot, but it's actually in turn been more brittle and more susceptible to damage, especially on installation. If you don't handle with care, they tend to break. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and start off with the leveling kit and kind of go over some of the little nuances that we found with these kits to help you prevent any damage to your boot or any other components to the vehicle. The first step in installing the leveling kit would be to loosen the top strut bolts, top strut nuts rather, and take some of the pressure off. All right, so by loosening the nuts up here, I've actually relieved some of the tension on the strut itself. So when you remove the bottom strut bolts, it doesn't fly out. And the reason you don't want that to do that is it will actually potentially cause damage to that boot. That strut cross pin will want to come out and can catch the side of that boot sometimes. So like I said, these boots are very fragile. They're not what everyone is used to. They're a lot more plastic than rubber, so you just got to be very careful when handling these. Next step is going to be to remove the axle nut. I mean, you need to remove it completely and make sure you push that axle back through the hub assembly. This is important as well, is when you move this knuckle out of the way, that you want to make sure you have enough misalignment on that boot that you do not pull it from the inner CV joint. If you do that, you break clips, you break boots. Another no good situation. You don't want that either. I cannot tell you guys enough how important it is to be gentle with these boots. So you'll notice that I'm going to unloosen the lower strut bolts, and this is what would happen if you did not loosen the top strut nuts prior to removing these bottom bolts. Again, this is not recommended. This is what could happen if you do not loosen the top nuts. You'll see right in here where the cross pin housing and the boot, they make contact. That's the area you need to be concerned of. That's why we loosen those top nuts. It will prevent that from popping out and minimize any contact with that area there. All right, so we've got top strut bolts loosened up here. We've got our upper control arm removed from our knuckle. We've got our axle nut removed, axle pushed through to gain the clearance and misalignment we need on the boots. Make sure we don't damage them that way. We've got our lower strut bolts removed. The only thing left to do now is remove the clips and install our leveling kit. I'm going to go ahead and lower control arm. Just be wary that if that axle starts pulling out from the inner CV, that you need to make sure that axle is being pushed back through the hub. Got our leveling kit installed. We need to ensure that the bolts go in head down, from the top down. All right, the next step will be to install the upper control arm ball joint nut. What we're gonna do here is we're not gonna install the whole ball joint nut. What we're gonna do is we're gonna start it. Get yourself a couple threads on there. Leave the rest loose, and then we're gonna install our axle nut and tighten that down first. All right, so the reason you do that is on the back side, the clearance between the axle boot and the lower control arm are very, very tight. So what this does is it pulls the axle into the location it needs to be, where there's a pocket in the control arm. So prior to tightening this, you tighten this, and that will give you the clearance you need to allow that boot to not pinch and tear. So you'll notice that the clearance between the boot and the strut itself is extremely tight. We're not dealing with a lot of room here. The envelope's extremely small, but you need to understand that this is at full droop, and everyday driving, you should never see full droop. So this is a worst case scenario, and when you're at ride height, the clearance opens up. You have all the clearance you need for days. You will never run into any issues. All right, so we're just about wrapped up with our leveling kit here. And let's just kind of do the touch points, highlights on the install, tips and tricks here. So number one, let's loosen those nuts on the top of the strut. We're gonna remove and push the axle back through the hub. We're gonna remove the upper control arm, be able to get this knuckle out of the way. That's gonna allow us to gain clearance to drop the bolt in the correct way, top down. And then when we go ahead and install it, we need to make sure that we start this nut. Don't tighten it, but we need to tighten this prior to that. All right, so that'll give you all the clearance you need. You shouldn't have any issues. Just remember, they're very fragile. You just need to be mindful that this is a different animal. This isn't a previous GM 1500. A lot of what we've just gone over with the leveling kit applies to the SST kit as well. We're going to loosen the nuts on top. We will eventually remove them completely. The strut will come out, and you'll apply a top strut spacer as well. But same applies here. We're going to loosen that axle nut. We're going to remove it completely. That way we can push that axle back through the hub and remove the upper ball joint out of the knuckle here. Get us that clearance that we need to be able to remove the strut assembly. Right now I'm loosening this upper control arm. Make it a little easy to gain access to the strut, gain access to the upper ball joint. It just makes it a little easier so you don't have to preload on these bushings. So like before, we had to remove the axle nut, make sure we can be able to push that axle back through. Gives us that misalignment we need. Make sure we don't remove or damage the inner clips of the CV and prevent any damage to the boot itself. This part is very, very important when installing this kit. You're going to lower the control arm much further than you would the leveling kit, and it requires that added misalignment. So very, very important. Make sure you guys do this. So the 4-inch kit does require you to remove the tie rod from the knuckle. This will allow you to get that strut out. The tie rod does get kind of in the way, so loosen that, pop it out of the way. The strut will fall out that direction. All right, as you can see how much clearance I've gained now that I've pushed that all the way through. This is the very vital point in this install. If you do not push that through, it pulls that inner CV out, and that's where you get the damage. It hyperextends this joint and easily tear the boot. Okay, so go ahead and push that through. It's not hard, it's not difficult at all. You do it with your thumb. Just make sure you pull that out. See plenty of clearance there. We're not hyperextending anything. Should be good to go. All right, so the next step, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the strut. I know everyone's done this, but you just need to be very, very careful with your tools around these boots, because yes, there are things that can damage, but these probably are #1 reason why these boots get damaged. Just be very careful. So I'm going to go ahead and lower this down as I can. And you can see, because this is loose, it's not pulling that inner CV joint out. So we're getting ready to install the preload spacer on our strut here. But the first thing you need to know is this is under extreme tension, and you need to be very careful when handling this. The other thing is you need to make sure that you use hand tools with this. These struts tend to not like any power tools, impact tools. The internal components can get damaged if you do use that. So go ahead and just add a little bit of tension here, not a whole lot, and then we're just going to undo this by hand. Okay, nuts off, and we're going to go ahead and remove the whole strut from the spring. Okay, so now we got the shock out of the strut rather. We're going to go ahead and remove the factory isolator off the spring perch, if I can. And then with the supplied preload spacer, it just slips right on over and sits on the spring perch like that. And then install it back in. Making sure that you use those alignment marks that you placed on the strut per our instructions. All right, remember this is under extreme tension, and to be very careful when working with this. And make sure you get that shock shaft just enough to get that nut started. And then tighten it back down with hand tools. You may actually have to loosen some of that tension to make sure that that shock shaft doesn't spin. We're ready to install our top strut spacer. Alright, when you install this, go ahead and start each nut before you run it all the way down. If you don't, you won't be able to get the rear nut on. Before we go ahead and install the strut back into the vehicle, we need to go ahead and remove the factory upper control arm and replace it with our aftermarket. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and install our ReadyLIFT upper control arm here. These control arms feature our non-bonded bushing, so when you install it, you can go ahead and tighten the upper control arm down completely, and it's not going to harm or bind these bushings. They're non-bonded, so you don't have to worry about that. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and torque these now. Like I mentioned before, these are non-bonded bushings, and it's completely okay. In fact, it's actually going to be easier to do this now with the strut removed. These are going to go ahead and get torqued to 90 foot-pounds. And go ahead and install the strut. Alright, so we've gone ahead and installed our preload spacer on our strut, our top hat, or our top strut spacer, and with all the precautions, make sure you use hand tools, cut the studs to the recommended length. We're going to go ahead and put this back in the truck. So when installing this, it might be a little easier to do it with a helper, and you'll see why here, that when I move the strut into place, this boot can kind of get in the way, and you want to be sure at all costs to protect that. So I'm going to go ahead and lift this out of the way, slip it in. Go ahead and start one of those nuts, keep it in the vehicle. All right, just like our leveling kit, we need to ensure that the bolts go in top down. And when we do so, we need to be careful, like we always do, of this boot here. All right, just like before, tools. Be careful. They're the #1 cause for damaging these boots. Okay, so before we go ahead and button this up and complete our installation here, I want to kind of point out what I was talking about earlier about how you need to ensure that the axle nut is tight prior to tightening the upper ball joint. There's a small pocket here. It's maybe difficult to see, but when you look it on your vehicle, you'll notice it. That's intended for the axle itself. If you do not tighten the axle nut prior to the upper control arm, it sits outside that pocket. When you tighten that upper control arm, it pinches it on the lower control arm between the boot and the axle shaft itself, and then you tighten that nut, it tears that boot every time. So you need to be very, very careful and understand that that step isn't just there because we think it should be. That is a necessity, and make sure you get that clearance on that boot before you tighten the upper control arm. All right, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up our installation here by swinging this axle back up, by swinging this knuckle back up into place here. And in doing so, we need to make sure that that axle goes back through the hub assembly, the splines engage, and even though there's nothing in the way, no clearance issues anymore, we need to be very careful that when we're installing this, that we're not hyperextending, possibly dragging it against another part of the vehicle. So we're going to go ahead and pop that up in place, pull our control arm down. Install our nut. And now get that axle nut back on there, tighten it down before we do this. Just to make sure that when you tighten this nut, that you're not actually pushing the axle back through while you're tightening it, go ahead and put a little pressure on the back side here. All right, so go ahead, tighten the upper ball joint. All right, so we're just about wrapped up here. We got to install our tie rod, our sway bar, our ABS brackets. Then we're gonna go ahead and finish our install, wrap up the passenger side, the rear, and we'll get it over on the alignment rack. I mean, just to kind of touch bases here, you guys need to be very careful in our installs. Make sure that the boots are always clear of any tools. Nut, loosen it. We don't want that springing out, hitting the boot. Axle, push that thing through, give us the clearance you need when you're installing it. And just really, overall, just read our instructions. It's very precise, very helpful, and it'll make sure that you guys have a flawless install. So thank you, and I really hope this has been a big help to you guys, and it'll really cut down on any maintenance costs. We really hope that you continue to use ReadyLIFT. Thank you.